This is but one of the legends of which the people speak. Long ago, in the final years of the Muromachi period, ships from European shores travelled to Japan. They brought with them many goods, but none enticed the locals quite like their card games. Soon all of Japan was playing. But as the country entered the Edo era, all Western influences were viewed with disdain, and the country exiled all that threatened their way of life. Japan's beloved cards were deemed as immoral gambling, and they too were banned across the kingdom. But then, as 255 years of isolation began, and the end of card games seemed at hand, a new style of card appeared as if from nowhere. To get past the ban, Japan had remade them in their own image, sporting the 4 seasons and 12 months in place of suits and numbers. These cards fought against their unjust exile and gave their players joy. The cards, created by Loophole and spread across the land, were christened Hanafuda. With 48 in each deck, the design seemed to escape the fate of its predecessors. Some were made to learn with, some to gamble, and some simply to play. But then, the shogun who had imposed the ban saw through the cunning deception. The cards they hated had merely transformed. Seeking to end this defiant rebellion, the cards that all thought had forever been saved by the Hanafuda decks were once again targeted by those who refused to accept their influence on the land. People who played for mere fun believed that their simple, non-gambling Hanafuda cards would be safe. But the cards were taken from them. Faced by an onslaught of strict law, the people could do nothing but appeal to those who hated their cards in vain. In their last hour, as doom for Hanafuda drew nigh, they left their future in the hands of fate. What became of those cards? Some remain who know. The lawful playing of the cards vanished, but their rules and games survived on the wind's breath. In certain parts of towns, it became customary to continue to play in complete secrecy against the land's law. Holding their deck of 48 cards, players aspire to teach their secret art to future generations and keep Hanafuda alive. The elders wished only for the youths of Japan to know the joy of Hanafuda and dream of a time when the cards would become legal once again. Today's episode features no video games, because we're going further back than we've ever gone before. Before the internet, before consoles, before Pong. If you can even picture such a time. Forget the games industry. There was no radio or movie industry. The amount of films that had ever been made was 4. 4 films! This is all of them. And there was a single filmmaker in the entire world, Louis Lee Prince. His first was made in 1887, the others in 1888, and then he mysteriously disappeared a couple of years later. But as interesting as he is, seriously, go look him up, we're not talking about him today. Instead, we're talking about the big N, Nintendo. This is their origins. Perhaps this is news for some of you, that Nintendo has existed for over a century. But for those that are into gaming history and trivia, it's not really a well-guarded secret. Before video games, Nintendo made a heck of a lot of other stuff, like the Ultra Hand, a love tester, and yes, love hotels, sort of. Kids, ask your parents in a few years what they're for. But Nintendo has always been a gaming company. Their first products were all about games. But as you may have guessed by this episode's opening history lesson, these were card games. Hanafuda card games. These cards had indeed been banned for centuries, starting in 1603 with the dawn of the Edo period. It was the shogun rule, with a strong dislike for Western influences, that closed off Japan's borders, but the enduring appeal of card games had survived, and Hanafuda cards were created to get around the ban. It didn't work. These cards, they were also banned. I'm simplifying a bit here. There was some leeway with educational games, but for the most part, any card games were done in secret for many, many years. It wouldn't be until 1868 that Japan would see serious changes through the Meiji Restoration. Power was transferred from the shogun and restored to the emperor, and after witnessing the technological advancements the West now had over Japan, in particular the impressive trading ships dubbed Black Ships by the Japanese due to their discolouring from so much use, Japan decided it quickly needed to catch up and surpass the West or risk being dominated by the technological gap. It wasn't an instant open door policy, but by 1885 the restrictions on Hanafuda cards being played and produced was finally lifted, and a huge potential market was born. Hanafuda stores were swiftly established. Beloved games were now legal to play, and a whole host of new Western games that had risen during the Edo period were being discovered. It was this emerging market that birthed Nintendo, via the mind of 30-year-old Fusajiro Yamauchi. Fusajiro was very fond of Hanafuda cards, having played illegally for many years. Now that the ban was lifted, he hoped to fully devote himself to his hobby. Already a skilled craftsman, Yamauchi knew the correct methods to create high-quality Hanafuda cards. He had been taught by a master of the craft, and worked under him for several years. Now, whether this skill was gained in secret during the ban, or within the few years after the ban was lifted, I can't say. But his life goals were larger than working for someone else. In 1889, he opened a small wooden stall in the Ohashi district of Kyoto to sell his own handmade cards. Sources are a tad inaccurate on whether this was initially a full shop or just a temporary market stand, but by September 23rd, 1889, Yamauchi definitely had a small storefront and workshop built and open for business. Nintendo Koppai had arrived. Within his little shop, he and a few employees set about creating the highest quality cards possible. Their craft was far too involved for any machine to manage, especially in the 1800s, so each and every card was handmade. The Chinese blackberry bush, Mitsumata, was used along with several layers of paper and clay. Although small, these cards were thick and the quality varied on the finish. This was problematic, as the coloured print on each was added via a wood press. It's kept the design of each pack uniform, and saved time since they didn't have to paint each card. But if the prints didn't apply correctly to the rough surfaces of a card, they had no choice but to discard all that hard work. Still, it seemed a worthwhile sacrifice to keep their standards high. Indeed, Nintendo very quickly made a name for themselves, at least locally. It was early days for the now legal card market, so plenty of families were after a nice set of high quality cards. In particular, the President line of cards proved popular, though they oddly featured no presidents, and instead French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Possibly he was mixed up with George Washington. This didn't seem to bother anyone though. Yet in the following year, Fusajiro saw sales grind to a halt. The problem was pretty simple. Most people don't have any use for more than one pack of playing cards, so while locals had happily rushed out to get his initial run of high quality prints, no one was in a real hurry to buy any more, unless they needed a replacement. Now Fusajiro had come up with a solution to save his young company, but before we get to that, we need to focus on names and folklore. Printed on Yamauchi's shop was the proud name Nintendo Koppai, meaning Nintendo playing cards. There's a fair bit of confusion though around the name Nintendo's meaning, and that's what we're about to dig into. All over the internet, people will tell you that Nintendo roughly translates to leave luck to heaven. And they're right, it does roughly translate to that. But it doesn't mean that was the intent. Now, bear with me, but we need to disregard the do of Nintendo. It's a common add-on to a Japanese company's name. It means sanctuary. It's meant to add a sense of importance to a company name. But the Ninten would not mean leave luck to heaven on its own. In fact, it's not even really a sentence. You couldn't go up to a Japanese speaker and go, "I say, old chap, Ninten and whatnot," and expect them to instantly know what you're wishing them. To actually say leave luck to heaven would be unwote ni makaseru, which, as you'll notice, does include the word ten in there. So it sort of invokes the spirit of the phrase, but doesn't directly mean it. Rather, nin suggests let someone do, and ten relates to the Shinto mythological beings, the Tengu. Sometimes demonic birds, creatures of war, and other times overprotective mountain and forest spirits with big noses. But either way, very godlike. Thus you can see the leave luck to heaven phrase's logic. Ninten meaning, let the gods do it. But in Florent Gorge's fantastic and incredibly useful source, The History of Nintendo, he argues that while the logic I gave you does make sense, it ignores any context from the world the name Nintendo was born from. Because Tengu plays a bigger role in this story than you might think. That's right folks, it's time for a concept to console random tangent into ancient Asian mythology. Because obviously, that's why you clicked on this video game show. Well, get ready for things to get a little bizarre. I give you the Tengu Tangent Spectacular. So, Tengu started off as Chinese spirits called Tiangao. They were space dogs. Kinda. They flew around comets and brought war. Also, they would occasionally eat the sun or moon, causing eclipses. You know, standard space dog stuff. Well, eventually, in Japanese culture, they morphed from space dogs to bird people. Nobody is quite sure why. might be to do with the Hindu eagle god Garuda, but it doesn't matter. Because the point is that eventually these bird people with big beaks turned into demon people with giant noses. Yes, I know this sounds like the biggest and strangest tangent we've taken in a while, but these noses are very important, and will make sense in just a second. You see, Hanafuda cards had flowers on them, because Hana means flower, so Hanafuda meant flower cards. Let's just ignore that I've technically been calling them flower cards this entire video. But the pronunciation of the word Hana, meaning flower, is exactly the same as the pronunciation of the word Hana, meaning nose. And goddammit, if there's one thing Japan seems to love, it's their wordplay. In the days of illegal gambling, people would rub their noses, as a not-so-subtle sign for, "I'd like to play Hanafuda, please." And who has a big nose? That's right, our old pal, Tengu. So, due to his big nose, Tengu got associated with people rubbing their nose, which in turn was associated with asking to play Hanafuda cards illegally. I hope you're taking notes, there will be a quiz. As he became an unofficial mascot for Hanafuda, Tengu might be being more directly referenced in Nintendo's name, with 10 not referring to gods in general, but to the card game itself. And so Gorge suggests that the real meaning behind Nintendo's name is in fact something closer to Temple of the Free Hanafuda, or the company that is allowed to make or sell Hanafuda. This probably could have been its own video in itself. It got way more complicated than I thought it would. And guess what? Nintendo themselves don't even know the real answer. Yamauchi's great-grandson and future Nintendo CEO, Hiroshi Yamauchi, is on record saying it's a plausible explanation, but he doesn't know if it's right. Oh yeah, we can pinpoint the day the shop opened and prove that the president cards featured Napoleon. Bonjour. But nobody at Nintendo ever thought to ask, by the way, what does the name Nintendo mean? Maybe we should jot it down on a post-it note for future generations. And we're not even done with Tengu yet. Before our little tangent, we were with Yamauchi in the middle of a sales slump dilemma. Well, Tengu would once again come to his aid. Essentially, Yamauchi realised the potential profits in a budget line of cards. Instead of throwing out lower quality or failed prints, he would now bundle them together in a new, cheaper deck, named Tengu. Which ends the Tengu Tangent Spectacular. The lower price point of Tengu attracted even more customers, and stabilised his falling profits, at least for the time being. It didn't solve the problem that eventually everyone who wanted a pack of cards would have one, and be reluctant to buy more. Finding a more regular form of customer was the only way to increase the scope of the business. The solution seems somewhat obvious, but it would prove a game changer for Nintendo. Casinos and gambling houses. But here's the catch. While playing cards was now legal, gambling with them was not. In fact, it's still illegal to this day in Japan to gamble. There are some exceptions, betting on certain races, pachinko, which for some reason isn't considered gambling, even though it kind of is. But casinos weren't really a thing. They're still not a thing, with one exception. As much as Nintendo would no longer want to admit this saved them, shady individuals such as the Yakuza were always interested in doing some gambling in their illegally ran gambling houses. Nintendo's own shop was located deep within the stomping grounds of the, and I apologise if I butcher this name, the Aizoko Tetsugai, one of Japan's oldest Yakuza groups. It had been established about 20 years prior to Nintendo, and the local populace was filled with Yakuza gamblers. It only made business sense to sell his wares to them. There was plenty of superstition surrounding gambling. Many would refuse to use a deck more than once to avoid cheating, so the local gambling parlours were always eager for new packs. Yamauchi struck a deal and signed some contracts. Almost 70 different gambling houses, each demanding an average of 50 packs a day. Profits soared, Nintendo had to expand, and a bright future was born. Nintendo would remain strong and profitable for about the next decade, but as the turn of the new century arrived, Yamauchi again set his sights on increasing Nintendo's influence, this time via the reintroduction of Western cards. Now, Nintendo wasn't the first by any means to sell them in Japan. They already had gained the name Turumpu cards, or trump cards. This renewed interest in Western cards arrived via a war between Russia and Japan in 1904. Japanese citizens were interested in this trump card variation and the new possible games, but more importantly, prisoners taken by the Japanese would often request playing cards, with a preference for Western packs. One such prison was within walking distance from Nintendo HQ. Fusajiro purchased Nintendo's very first US printing machine and fulfilled the demand. Printing Western cards in Japan let Nintendo sell them at a much lower price than competitors who had to import them. They were the only company in the entire nation who could produce their own trump cards. Little did Nintendo realize at the time how important this would become, as soon a new threat emerged: the Karutazai tax. This tax was created to fund the war effort, but its high demand more than doubled the price of cards. This spelt the end for many of Nintendo's rivals, but thanks to their US printing press, Nintendo were able to maintain their grip on the playing card market and survive the tax. It was a close call though, and Yamauchi realised that if he wanted to avoid similar risks in the future, he had no choice but to again increase Nintendo's scope. It was time to go nationwide. Ever the entrepreneur, Fusajiro looked at similar products with a wide release. The most successful being the tobacco industry. Cigars and cigarettes had recently become very popular and fashionable, much like in the rest of the world. And it was a product that just so happened to come in a box almost identical in size to a pack of cards. Being used to making distribution deals and contracts by this point, Nintendo and tobacco distributor Nihon Senbai joined forces, and the novel concept of cards and cigars was born. Another thing that I don't think family-friendly Nintendo would proudly tell you about today. The idea was you'd buy them, invite some friends over for a social evening, smoke some tobacco, and play some games. Even 100 years ago, Nintendo was all about local multiplayer. This concept was a runaway success, a triumph. For Fusajiro Yamauchi, it was everything he'd ever hoped to achieve. He'd gone from a small local market seller to the biggest card maker in all of Japan. But as the 1920s came to an end, and Fusajiro was preparing to enter his 70th year, there was one thing that still bothered him: a successor. Someone to take over Nintendo after his retirement. He had a daughter, but no male heir. Finding heirs for Nintendo would become a recurring problem. Fusajiro's solution was an arranged marriage to his daughter. This was not uncommon at the time. She married Sekiryo Kaneda, who would take the Yamauchi name as his own. His legacy secured, at least for now, Fusajiro handed the reins of management over to his new son-in-law, and a new era began. The business finally registered itself as a private company under its new owner. This was the end for Nintendo Koppai, but it was just the beginning for Yamauchi Nintendo. This is just the origins of Nintendo. There's still a lot of this story to tell. We've only covered the first 50-ish years. I intend this to be a little series we'll come back to now and then. We've still got to talk about love hotels, Disney, and the strange adventures of the runaway Nintendo heir. Video games are a long way off. But I hope you'll join me for more installments sometime in the future, as we go from Hanafuda to handhelds. Thank you ever so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, a comment, a like, or most of all, sharing it with others is deeply appreciated. Make sure to hit that notification bell to not miss out on any new episodes. Next episode, we're back with Nintendo, this time in the 1990s, to unravel the mystery of an unreleased console. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you all on the next From Concept to Console.